Hi everyone, Suzanne here. I hope you're all well and welcome to Sew Custom. Today's video, as you will have already seen from the thumbnail, is how I sewed up this little number. So if you're interested in seeing that, then let's get started.
Starting with the fabric, this is a linen in this gorgeous blue and white stripe. It has a lovely drape to it, perfect for a project like this. And on to the cutting out. This is my front. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, a notch to mark my placket, the usual sleeve notches, and one at each side of the waist. And here, just popping in a pin to mark where my pockets will be placed. Replacing that pin with a chalk mark. So that's my front cut out, notched and marked. Now on to the pockets. I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, and I have a little bit of prep work to do here before I can add these to my dress front. So I need to press in all of my edges, and I'm going to start with the top. So I'm just pressing first of all my seam allowance, so 1 centimetre in underneath, and then pressing again by about an inch this time. So that's the top of my pocket done. And for the sides, pressing again by 1 centimetre. And then to give me a nice clean finish, I'm just going to turn that raw edge in underneath and press. I'll do that on the other side and the bottom, and this is how it looks. So that's all my pressing complete. Now to take care of that top edge. So I'm just going to fold it back on itself at that crease line, leaving my 1 centimetre seam allowance on top, and pin, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, and back stitching to finish. So I'll turn that edge right side out and give that a press, which you can see I've done here. And now that that's done, I'm ready to stitch down my edges. Back stitching to start, using a little bit of a longer stitch length, stitching right along that inner crease edge, pivoting up my corners, trying to be as neat as possible here, as these stitches will show on the outside. And finishing with a back stitch. So I've given that a bit of a press, and this is the result. So that's my pocket all fully prepped and ready to be added to my dress front. So just lining up my top corners with my chalk marks, pinning into place, and ready to stitch. Starting at the top, stitching right along the edge of the pocket, pivoting up my corners, again trying to be as neat as I possibly can be here. And finishing with a back stitch. And you can see here that this preparation gives me 2 lines of stitching around the outside, which I really like. So now that my pockets are all in place, I have one final bit of prep work to do on the front, and that is to press my placket. So just like the pocket before, I'm pressing in underneath my seam allowance, and then folding again at that notch you seen me snip earlier, and pressing. I'll finish that off camera, and this is how it looks. So that's my front fully prepped and ready to be added to the back at the side seams. So onto the back, my fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch at the waist, the usual sleeve notches, and one at the centre back neck. So that's my back cut out and notched and ready to be joined to my front at the side seams. So laying my front over the top, my fabric is right sides together, lining up my notches, lining up my edges and pinning, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, and back stitching to finish. So for this dress, I've decided to fell the seams. So to do that, I'm just going to trim down the seam allowance on one side. So taking away probably about 2/3 of that allowance here. I'll finish that off camera, and this is the result. And here, just tucking that untrimmed seam allowance in underneath, encasing those raw edges and pressing. So that's that all pressed the whole way down. So I'm going to stitch right along that crease edge from the underarm point the whole way down to the hem. Back stitching to start, using that same longer stitch length, trying to hug that crease edge the whole way down, and finishing with a back stitch. And I've given that seam a good press, and this is how it looks. Everything's nicely tucked away, so happy with that. So now that my front and back are joined at the side seams, I'm ready to finish my hem. So just like before, I'm pressing in underneath by about 1 centimeter, pressing again, this time by about 1 inch. And I finish that off camera. So that's my hem all pressed into place, and I'm going to stitch this down right along that crease edge. Starting with a back stitch, using that same longer stitch length, hugging that crease edge the whole way across, and finishing with a back stitch. So that's had a good press, and this is how it looks. So now that my hem's all complete, I'm ready to tackle my waist. And for this dress, I've chosen an elastic waist, and for that I need a casing. My fabric underneath is on the fold. I have a notch at the top and bottom of the fold line, and one to indicate my side seam, top and bottom. So before I can add this to my dress, I have a little bit of prep work to do. So I'm just folding in underneath my 1 centimeter seam allowance, on top and bottom, and pressing into place. And once it's all pressed, this is how it looks, and ready to be added to my dress. Lining up my notches at the side seam and the waist on both sides, and pinning into place. And I'm going to stitch right along that crease line on both top and bottom the whole way across. Starting with a back stitch, using that same longer stitch length, trying to be as neat as possible here and hug that edge the whole way across, and finishing with a back stitch. So that's the top all sewn down. Now for that bottom edge. So I've skipped ahead a bit and I'm just finishing here with a back stitch. So that's my casing all sewn into place. It's had a press, and now that that's done, I'm ready to add my elastic. So I've just popped a safety pin on one end and starting at one side, threading that elastic the whole way through to the other. And I've just secured that elastic on both ends with a pin, ready to take to the machine to tack into place. So using that same longer stitch length, back stitching, sewing right over the top of the elastic and finishing with a back stitch. And of course I do exactly the same to the other side, and this is how it looks. So super happy with this. So now that that's complete, I'm ready for my sleeves. So I have 2 layers of fabric underneath my pattern piece, the usual sleeve notches, so that's that cut out and notched. So the first thing to do here is to sew those underarm seams. So just laying one side over the other, my fabric is right sides together and pinning, and stitching here at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, starting and finishing with a back stitch. And I'm going to use the same seam finish here as I used on my side seams. So just trimming down one side of that seam allowance, pressing the other over the top, encasing those raw edges, and ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, sewing right along the crease edge and finishing with a back stitch. So I've given that a good press, and now that that's done, I'm ready to finish my hem. And I'm finishing here in exactly the same way as I finished the dress hem, so folding in underneath about 1 centimeter, pressing, folding again, this time by about 1 inch, and pressing. And I'm going to stitch right along that crease edge, but this time I'm going to leave a gap of about 1 inch. Back stitching to start, using that same longer stitch length, and finishing with a back stitch, as I say, about 1 inch or so away from my starting point. So that's my little gap, which I'll use to feed in some elastic. So just like the waist before, I've popped a safety pin on one end and just feeding it through that channel the whole way around. Overlapping my ends and popping in a pin, and ready to stitch. So I'm running a zigzag stitch just along each of those raw edges, coming back and forth a couple of times, making sure it's nice and secure. So that's the first one done, and the second. So now the last thing I have to do, just to finish off the hem of the sleeve, is to run a straight stitch right along that crease line to close up that little gap. Back stitching to start, and back stitching to finish. So now that my hem is all tucked away and my elastic is nicely encased, I'm ready to add my sleeve to my dress. So laying it right sides together, lining up the underarm, lining up my notches, and pinning. And I'll pop a few more pins in off camera and ready to stitch. Backstitching to start at my 1 centimeter seam allowance, taking it nice and gently around that curve and finishing with a backstitch. And I'm going to fill this seam as well. So trimming down one side, pressing the untrimmed side, making sure that raw edge is nicely tucked away, and stitching here right along that crease edge, starting with a back stitch, using that same longer stitch length as before, and finishing with a back stitch. So that seam's had a good press, and this is the result. Everything tucked away. And now that that's done, I'm ready to finish my neckline. So just like the hem of my sleeves, I'm folding in underneath by about 1 centimeter, pressing, folding again by about 1 inch this time, and pressing. And ready to stitch. Back stitching to start, using that same longer stitch length, trying to hug that crease edge the whole way across, and finishing with a back stitch. So that's my casing all sewn down and ready for elastic. So I've popped my safety pin at one end, and I'm just feeding my elastic the whole way through that channel. And once it's all done, this is how it looks. So just like I did on the waist, I need to secure each of those ends. So just running a straight stitch right along the edge of that elastic, back stitching to start and to finish. So now that my elastic is tacked into place, I'm ready to close up that center front. So I've just folded back my placket and pinned it into place. And here, just laying one side over the other, making sure my edges are lined up top and bottom, and pinning into place. This is a perfectly usable placket as it is, but I'm going to make it a mock placket. So to do that, I'm going to run a stitch line along each side of the placket, from the neck right down to that bottom pin. I'm going to back stitch, move the fabric from in underneath out of the way, and stitch down the crease edge, giving myself a little split at the bottom. So starting at the neck with the back stitch, using the same longer stitch length as I've been using throughout, sewing right along the placket edge, coming up to my pin, back stitching, moving the fabric from underneath out of the way, and continuing my stitch line the whole way down to the hem, and finishing with a back stitch. And I've done exactly the same thing on the other side. It's had a press, and this is how it looks. So super happy with this. And now I just have one final thing to do to complete my dress, and that is to add some buttons down that center front. So I'm just measuring here about 1.5 inches or so below the neck, and then at 3-inch intervals right down to the top of my split. And I'll stitch these little tortoiseshell buttons off camera, and this is the result. And with that, this little dress is complete. So I have my placket all stitched down, I've got my elastic right across the top of my neck, my sleeves all in, my elastic around the hem, elastic at the waist, my pockets in place, that lovely split at the bottom of my mock placket, my hem in place, And from the inside, all of my edges just the way I like them, tucked away. And this is what it looks like on. And I could not be happier with how this has turned out. It's a super comfortable dress. As you've just seen, there's no fastenings. It's just pull over your head and on. I like that it's not too fitted, but yet there's a nice silhouette with all the elastic. It's super versatile. I've teamed it up here with trainers, slides and sandals, and I think it looks great with all three. And if you've been following along on Instagram, you'll have seen the inspiration for this one. And I think I've got it pretty much spot on. I don't think they used a mock placket, but I am super happy with how mine has turned out.
So I really hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you found it useful. If you did, give it a thumbs up. If you've not yet subscribed, please do, and I shall see you guys on Friday. Until then, I hope you have a fantastic week. Bye, folks!